When people recall 2008, they remember panic, failing banks, frozen credit markets, emergency bailouts announced overnight. What is remembered is the noise. What is forgotten is the design work that followed. The global financial system did not collapse in 2008. It was interrupted, stabilized, and then quietly re-engineered under extraordinary conditions. In history, the most consequential moments rarely arrive as explosions. Empires do not usually end in a single battle. Monetary regimes do not vanish in a day. They fracture, pause, adapt, and continue under new rules that feel technical rather than dramatic. Rome survived centuries after its first fiscal crisis. The gold standard survived long after it stopped functioning as advertised. Power systems endure by transforming themselves. The crisis of 2008 functioned as a controlled rupture. It revealed which institutions were indispensable, which rules could be suspended, and how far authorities could intervene without losing public consent. Emergency measures were framed as temporary, yet they established precedents that would never fully retreat. Balance sheets expanded. Liquidity facilities multiplied. The boundary between market risk and state responsibility blurred. Public attention remained fixed on visible failures, bankrupt firms, foreclosed homes, and volatile markets. Meanwhile, the deeper shift occurred elsewhere. Central banks assumed roles once considered unthinkable. Governments normalized deficit expansion as a permanent condition. Crisis governance moved from exception to baseline, justified by the need to prevent recurrence. This distinction matters because systemic danger does not peak during panic. It accumulates afterward. The most hazardous phase begins when stabilization is declared a success and the architecture built in emergency becomes ordinary. Each intervention narrows future options. Each safeguard reduces tolerance for instability. Over time, the system becomes less flexible, more dependent, and more centralized. This is why 2026 should not be imagined as a replay of 2008. There may be no single shock, no dramatic failure demanding immediate rescue. Instead, pressure will surface through administrative decisions, regulatory changes, and structural adjustments made in the name of continuity. The disruption will feel procedural, not chaotic. It will arrive through documents, committees, frameworks, and safeguards described as prudent management. Authority will be exercised through standards and protocols, not force. The language of emergency will fade, replaced by the language of optimization, resilience, and risk reduction. That subtlety is precisely what makes the transition durable. It invites compliance by appearing inevitable, technical, and neutral. The question, then, is not whether the system will break. It is whether it can continue without redesigning the society beneath it. When temporary solutions no longer suffice, systems do not announce collapse. They change form. And history shows that this transformation is often the moment when power becomes most concentrated and least visible. When the financial crisis of 2008 is recalled, the explanation usually begins and ends with excess reckless banks, irresponsible borrowers, and toxic mortgages. This framing is incomplete. The true failure did not originate with bad loans alone, but with the collapse of trust inside a highly leveraged financial system that depended on continuous confidence to function. Modern banking operates less like vaults of cash and more like networks of promises. Institutions borrow short, lend long, and rely on the assumption that counterparties will honor obligations tomorrow. In 2008, that assumption broke. Assets did not suddenly become worthless. They became suspect. No one could be certain what was held on whose balance sheet or how deeply losses might cascade. As doubt spread, liquidity vanished. Interbank lending froze. Institutions that appeared solvent on paper could not fund daily operations. This distinction matters because it explains why crises propagate so quickly. Losses can be absorbed over time. Confidence cannot. Once trust disappears, leverage transforms from efficiency into fragility. Authorities responded with speed and coordination. Central banks opened emergency lending facilities, expanded collateral eligibility, and provided currency swap lines across borders. Governments issued guarantees and injected capital into key institutions. These actions were described as rescues, but their true purpose was containment. The objective was not to repair the system, but to prevent disorderly collapse. What followed was a suspension of normal market discipline. Price discovery was delayed. Weak institutions were preserved. Balance sheets were stabilized through public backstops rather than private resolution. The system was effectively frozen in place, allowing time to pass without forcing structural change. Equally important is what did not occur. There was no comprehensive deleveraging. Financial complexity was not meaningfully reduced. Accountability was selective and limited. Instead of absorbing losses internally, the system transferred risk upward. Private liabilities were transformed into public obligations, embedding financial instability within sovereign balance sheets. This shift resolved the immediate liquidity crisis, but it introduced a deeper problem. Governments could replace funding, But they could not restore credibility without assuming responsibility for outcomes they did not fully control. Over time, solvency concerns replaced liquidity concerns, and legitimacy replaced confidence as the central constraint. By treating a structural imbalance as a temporary malfunction, 2008 postponed reckoning rather than resolving it. The same tools that stabilized markets also set boundaries on future action. As debt levels rose and dependence on intervention deepened, the margin for repetition narrowed. Political constraints hardened, public trust thinned, and institutional credibility became increasingly fragile. This is why the next crisis cannot be managed the same way. The system has already used its most effective remedies, and their side effects are now permanent. The concept of a debt supercycle describes a long period in which economic growth becomes increasingly dependent on leverage rather than productivity. In its early stages, debt accelerates expansion. Capital is deployed, infrastructure is built, and future income comfortably services present borrowing. Over time, however, the relationship reverses. Growth slows, but debt does not. Borrowing shifts from enabling progress to preventing contraction. Today, public, corporate, and household debt levels are not merely elevated compared to 2008. They are foundational. Governments borrow not to expand capacity, but to service existing obligations and stabilize budgets. Corporations borrow less to invest than to refinance, consolidate, or support equity prices. Households borrow to preserve living standards as wages lag costs. Debt is no longer optional. It is the mechanism by which continuity itself is maintained. This represents a structural change. The system no longer advances by creating new value. It moves forward by rolling existing liabilities. Each cycle requires larger interventions to achieve smaller effects. What once produced growth now only delays adjustment. The appearance of stability is sustained, but resilience erodes beneath it. History offers patterns rather than predictions. In the later Roman Empire, fiscal extraction intensified as productive capacity weakened, shifting governance from expansion to enforcement. In post-World War Europe, debt obligations constrained policy choices, producing prolonged stagnation and political instability. These examples are not parallels to be copied, but signals to be recognized. When obligations exceed real economic output, power systems adjust their priorities. Growth becomes secondary to control. At the center of this constraint lies a critical limitation. Central banks can create liquidity, but they cannot create solvency. They can extend timelines, but they cannot restore trust once balance sheets are universally strained. As debt compounds faster than income, traditional tools lose force. Lower interest rates fail to stimulate. Asset purchases stabilize prices but distort incentives. Bailouts prevent collapse without restoring confidence. Each intervention reduces flexibility. Each rescue embeds dependency. The margin for error narrows as balance sheets, both public and private, approach saturation. There is no external entity left to absorb losses without consequence. Risk has nowhere higher to go. This is why 2026 represents a constraint moment rather than a crisis in the conventional sense. The system still functions, but its options are limited. Any response to renewed stress will require explicit trade-offs: inflation to reduce real burdens, surveillance to manage compliance, capital controls to prevent flight, structural changes to reorganize participation. At this stage, financial management alone is insufficient. Choices once framed as technical become political by necessity. The debt supercycle does not end with collapse. It ends with transformation as systems adjust to limits they can no longer defer. Monetary authority was built slowly through decades of credibility, restraint, and repetition. Central banks learned to shape expectations as much as outcomes. By promising stability and delivering it often enough, they became trusted stewards of economic cycles. That trust was their most powerful instrument. Today, that instrument is weakening. For much of the late 20th century, monetary tools worked because conditions allowed them to. Debt levels were manageable. Globalization suppressed prices through labor arbitrage and supply chain efficiency. When downturns arrived, interest rates could be cut without destabilizing currencies. Quantitative easing could be deployed without igniting inflation. Forward guidance anchored expectations because institutions were believed. Those conditions no longer hold. The same tools now produce different effects. Low rates inflate asset values faster than incomes. Liquidity flows unevenly, widening inequality and concentrating wealth. Currency stability becomes fragile as policy divergence invites capital movement and speculation. What once appeared neutral now carries visible distributional consequences, drawing central banks into political debate. This shift has eroded trust. Monetary institutions remain powerful, but their actions are increasingly questioned. They are blamed for housing shortages, market distortions, and declining purchasing power. Yet they are not free agents. They operate within systems shaped by past decisions, constrained by debt burdens they did not create but must manage. Central bankers are best understood as technocrats caught in a narrowing corridor. Each intervention prevented immediate failure. Each also reduced future flexibility. Success bred dependency. Markets adjusted behavior around expected support. Risk migrated outward, assuming eventual rescue. Over time, emergency measures became structural features. This dynamic creates policy asymmetry. Tightening conditions produces immediate and visible pain. Easing produces slower, more diffuse instability. Political systems respond more readily to sudden distress than to gradual erosion. As a result, authorities are incentivized toward accommodation even as returns diminish. Intervention becomes permanent not because it works well, but because alternatives appear worse. By 2026, central banks no longer function primarily as shock absorbers. They transmit pressure through the economy. Interest rate changes affect housing access directly. Asset programs influence labor dynamics and savings behavior. Communication itself moves markets and shapes social expectations. Monetary policy now intersects with daily life in ways that strain legitimacy. When trust fades and tools lose precision, monetary management cannot remain confined to markets. Stability must be enforced through other means. Regulatory frameworks expand. Fiscal coordination deepens. Behavioral compliance becomes relevant. This transition does not require conspiracy or intent. It follows institutional logic. When monetary authority reaches exhaustion, governance fills the gap. That shift marks a fundamental change in how power is exercised and where it resides. Monetary exhaustion does not end authority, it relocates it, moving influence from markets toward administrative structures designed to preserve continuity under constraint. The phrase, "the Great Reset," is often treated as provocation or speculation. In practice, it describes a familiar institutional process. Resets occur when existing systems can no longer be stabilized through incentives alone. When price signals, interest rates, and market coordination fail to deliver order, authority shifts toward rule changes. This is not ideological, it is procedural. Historically, economic systems rely on markets during periods of expansion and surplus. Markets allocate resources efficiently when volatility is low and confidence is high. During sustained instability, that reliance weakens. Authorities intervene first to smooth outcomes, then to constrain behavior. Over time, governance moves from managing results to shaping participation itself. Post-crisis governance increasingly blends economic policy with behavioral management. Access becomes conditional. Stability is tied to compliance. Coordination replaces competition in critical sectors. These patterns are not new. Wartime rationing systems linked consumption to registration and eligibility. Post-depression labor controls tied employment to national recovery goals. Emergency economic planning regimes centralized decision-making under the logic of necessity. The common thread is not intent, but inevitability. When volatility threatens legitimacy, predictability becomes the overriding objective. Institutions seek systems that reduce uncertainty, even at the cost of flexibility. Digital infrastructure enables this shift by standardizing transactions, monitoring flows, and enforcing rules automatically. Regulatory frameworks expand to define acceptable behavior, not merely acceptable risk. Crises provide justification for permanence. Measures introduced as temporary responses acquire administrative depth. Databases persist. Oversight mechanisms remain active. Coordination structures outlive the emergencies that created them. What begins as exceptional becomes ordinary because dismantling it appears riskier than maintaining it. This transition marks a shift from market-led coordination to administratively enforced stability. Markets still operate, but within narrower corridors. Outcomes are guided more by frameworks than by price discovery alone. Participation becomes structured. Choice exists, but within predefined boundaries. This is why the reset should not be understood as a moment or announcement. It is a phase change. The system does not collapse or reboot. It reorganizes. Authority migrates from indirect influence toward direct architecture. Control becomes embedded in systems rather than asserted through decree. By 2026, this evolution will be more visible. Not because it arrives suddenly, but because its components have matured. The environment will feel quieter, more procedural, and more regulated. The difference from 2008 will not be intensity, but texture. Less chaos, more management, less emergency language, more normalization. The reset, in this sense, is not a break from the past. It is the continuation of a process set in motion when markets could no longer absorb stress on their own. When incentives fail, systems do not retreat. They redesign the structures through which society operates. In 2008, the global system still possessed a critical stabilizer integration. Capital, goods, and liquidity could move across borders with relatively few barriers. Stress in one region was absorbed by activity in another. Currency markets, supply chains, and financial flows acted as shock absorbers, redistributing pressure before it concentrated. That architecture no longer functions in the same way. Over the past decade, globalization has shifted from expansion to segmentation. Geopolitical competition, security concerns, and domestic political pressures have reshaped trade and finance. Supply chains that were optimized for cost are now restructured for control. Redundancy has been reduced in favor of strategic alignment. The result is a system that appears efficient on paper, but lacks flexibility under strain. Fragmentation reduces resilience in subtle ways. When production is concentrated among trusted partners, disruptions propagate more quickly. When currencies are used as tools of policy leverage, financial flows become politicized. When access to markets is conditioned on alignment, cooperation gives way to parallel systems that cannot easily compensate for one another. These changes are structural, not episodic. Friend-shoring replaces open sourcing. Trade blocs harden into semi-independent zones. Parallel payment systems develop to bypass perceived vulnerabilities. Strategic resources are stockpiled, restricted, or leveraged for influence. Each of these measures is rational in isolation. Together, they weaken the system's ability to distribute stress. In earlier eras, a crisis in one region could be offset by surplus capacity elsewhere. Today, coordination is constrained by rivalry. Protective actions in one jurisdiction transmit instability to others. Export controls generate shortages. Sanctions redirect flows, but also fragment markets. Capital controls, intended to preserve domestic stability, create liquidity gaps abroad. This dynamic increases the likelihood of policy conflict. Authorities act to defend local systems, often without fully accounting for spillover effects. Measures designed to stabilize one economy can destabilize another. What once functioned as mutual insurance now behaves as a set of competing defenses. The absence of shared frameworks compounds the problem. Institutions that once facilitated coordination face declining authority. Rules become contested. Standards diverge. Even when common interests exist, trust deficits delay cooperation. The time required to reach agreement increases precisely when speed is most valuable. The significance for 2026 lies not in any single flashpoint. It lies in the system's reduced capacity to respond collectively. Fragmentation transforms localized stress into systemic pressure because there are fewer neutral pathways for relief. Every shock is absorbed more narrowly, intensifying its impact. This reinforces the central pattern of the documentary. The danger does not emerge from a singular failure, but from the weakening of connective tissue. A system that no longer moves together cannot stabilize together. Disunity magnifies volatility. In a fragmented global structure, even manageable disruptions become harder to contain, not because they are larger, but because the mechanisms that once spread and softened their effects have been deliberately dismantled. Economic systems are often analyzed through aggregates, growth rates, inflation measures, employment figures. But systems ultimately fail or adapt at the level of lived experience. Prolonged economic pressure does not only weaken markets. It reshapes how individuals relate to institutions, authority, and one another. Chronic stress operates differently from sudden collapse. Housing costs that rise faster than income do not provoke panic, but resignation. Employment precarity does not always trigger protest, but constant calculation. Cost of living pressure narrows attention, shortens planning horizons, and erodes confidence in long-term stability. Over time, this pressure accumulates, producing fatigue rather than outrage. As stress becomes persistent, trust decays. Not only trust in markets, but trust in systems that claim to manage them. Institutions are no longer judged by ideology or intent, but by perceived effectiveness. When outcomes feel consistently misaligned with effort, legitimacy weakens. The system may still function, but belief in its fairness and responsiveness declines. History suggests that late-stage systems rarely fail through open rebellion alone. More often, they hollow out. Participation diminishes. Civic engagement narrows. Compliance becomes conditional rather than assumed. People continue to operate within structures, but with reduced commitment. Rules are followed pragmatically, not internalized as shared norms. This disengagement is subtle. It does not require mass demonstrations or visible unrest. It appears in declining turnout, informal workarounds, withdrawal from formal processes, and rising polarization between groups experiencing different levels of pressure. Social cohesion thins as individuals retreat into narrower circles of trust. The danger here is not revolt, but fragmentation of consent. Systems depend on a baseline level of voluntary participation to function efficiently. When that consent weakens, enforcement costs rise. Coordination becomes harder. Authority must work harder to achieve the same outcomes. By this stage, economic instability can no longer be addressed solely through financial tools. Rate adjustments and fiscal transfers may ease symptoms, but they do not restore trust once it has eroded. Managing stress shifts from economic calibration to social regulation. Compliance mechanisms expand. Eligibility criteria tighten. Behavior becomes a variable to be governed. This transition reinforces a pattern already in motion. As markets lose their ability to self-correct without social fallout, institutions adapt by embedding stability into social frameworks. Access, participation, and legitimacy become managed variables rather than assumed conditions. By 2026, the significance of social stress lies in its cumulative effect. Not dramatic collapse, but gradual disengagement. Not rebellion, but withdrawal. Economic pressure becomes political risk not when people rise up, but when they quietly stop believing that existing systems serve them. At that point, stability requires more than economic adjustment. It requires social architecture capable of maintaining order under conditions of sustained strain. By this stage, the contours of the argument are clear. What lies ahead is not defined by a single event, shock, or failure. It is defined by convergence. Multiple buffers that once absorbed stress have been drawn down at the same time. Debt capacity, monetary credibility, global coordination, and social trust have each been stretched to their limits. None is fully collapsed. That is precisely the point. Systems rarely fail all at once. They cross thresholds quietly. As options narrow and adaptations become permanent, 2026 represents such a crossing point. Not because something dramatic must occur, but because there are fewer ways left to respond without changing the structure itself. What once could be delayed, diluted, or externalized must now be addressed directly. This returns us to the central thesis. Systems do not announce their transformation. They normalize it. Changes are introduced incrementally, framed as technical improvements, efficiency gains, or resilience measures. Each step appears reasonable in isolation. Over time, the cumulative effect reshapes how power operates and how society is organized. What comes next will not present itself as crisis. It will present itself as management. Stability will be emphasized over flexibility, predictability over autonomy, coordination over spontaneity. These shifts will be described as modernization, risk reduction, and prudent governance. They will feel less disruptive than collapse, and therefore easier to accept. History counsels humility here. No system understands itself as ending. Each believes it is adapting to new conditions. The Roman Empire did not see decline, it saw reform. Post-war financial regimes did not see exhaustion, they saw innovation. In every case, emergency measures extended just long enough to become ordinary. The danger does not lie in catastrophe, it lies in permanence. Emergency logic, once normalized, rarely retreats on its own. Temporary frameworks become default settings. Exceptional authority becomes routine. The language of necessity outlasts the conditions that justified it. This documentary has not argued for inevitability, nor offered prescriptions. It has traced patterns. It has shown how decisions made to preserve stability accumulate into structural change. It has explained why repeating old solutions yields diminishing returns, and why management increasingly replaces markets when volatility persists. The distinction between 2008 and 2026 captures this shift. 2008 was a financial crisis. It unfolded rapidly, visibly, and demanded immediate intervention. It was resolved in appearance through containment. 2026 is not that. It is a structural moment, defined by constraints rather than shocks. Understanding this difference matters. Financial crisis can be addressed with liquidity and time. Structural crises reshape the environment in which choices are made. They alter incentives, redefine participation, and redistribute authority. The crossing point is quiet. That is why it is often missed. By the time it is widely recognized, the system has already adapted, not broken, but transformed.